Indoor air quality kills more people every 2 weeks than all the global wars do every year in a typical year. How do we start to see the built environment as an extension to human health and well-being?
Treating buildings as part of caring for health requires bringing the medical community into this discussion.
What does a good indoor environmental health look like?
An indoor space that does not increase our physiological stress level.
Where are the Elon Musks? Where are the superstar innovators? Where are the next big leaps coming from? Who are the people that the young people can look up to and say, this is an exciting space or an exciting company to go into? We need innovators and leaders and people that are prepared to think outside the box and look at the built environment in fundamentally different ways.
We have to have a realistic finish line. To manage buildings from the perspective of human health, it will be one of the biggest advances of our century.
Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Stephanie Taylor. It was my absolute pleasure to welcome back to the podcast this week someone who I seem to bump into everywhere I go. From sharing cabs in India to drinks in Las Vegas, she is one of my favourite people to bump into around the world. If you don't know her, she is a unique physician architect whose career is dedicated to bridging the deep chasm between the medical profession and the built environment. Having earned her medical degree from Harvard, she observed a troubling trend of patients being harmed by the very buildings meant to heal them. This realization drove her back to academia to earn a master's in architecture, providing her with the dual expertise needed to treat the building as an extension of the patient's own physiological health. Today, as an ASHRAE Fellow and Distinguished Lecturer, she is a leading global voice advocating for health as a building performance metric, pushing the industry to move beyond simple comfort and energy goals towards scientifically backed wellness standards. Her work has been particularly known for her focus on the microbiome of the built environment and the critical role of indoor air quality in human immunity. She has been a pivotal figure in highlighting how factors like low relative humidity can impair our respiratory defences and increase the transmission of infectious bioaerosols. As medical advisor for ThinkLite Air, she applies her clinical insights to development of advanced air sensing and cleaning technology, transforming raw environmental data into actionable health impact scores. By integrating medical science into engineering standards, she continues to champion the idea that engineers are, in many ways, the physicians of the future, responsible for the preventative care of billions of people who spend so much of their time indoors. As usual with us, this was a wandering conversation, but I think full of insight from someone who sees our buildings from a perspective of the person, of health and resilience. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Stephanie Taylor.
It's great to see you. I'm not just saying that. It is good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you too. Yeah, and we've actually seen each other fairly regularly over the last 12 months or so. So it's been great. We'll have to try and keep that going. What are your movements over the next kind of few months? Are you going to get over to Singapore for Indoor Air, do you think?
Oh my gosh. So next week I go to Canada for 3 ASHRAE Distinguished Lecture presentations. Then I go to Arkansas for more ASHRAE DL. And then Greece. Aren't you going to be in Greece?
No, I think we've spoken about this actually. Now it clashes with something else. Is that May, I think, or April? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it clashes definitely with something else I'm doing.
So Greece is the HYGEA, Unification of Medicine and Engineering,
yep,
which is phenomenal tagline. So Greece, and then, yes, I'm going to Singapore. So presenting at ISIAC, and then right after that is ASHRAE in Austin. I have a couple presentations there. And then Joe Steebrook's Building Summer Camp, which is always a phenomenal, wonderful experience.
Brilliant.
In Westford, Mass.
There's certainly no cobwebs will ever grow on you with the amount you move around. That's for sure. one of the most mobile people I know. I think the only person I probably is comparable to is either the chair of ASHRAE themselves, because they're just permanently on the move. Chandra Sekhar seems to be permanently on tour as well. The ASHRAE Distinguished Lectures seem to provide a really good opportunity to travel and present stuff, don't they?
Oh my gosh, the DL program is great. I've been part of that now for, I don't know, coming up on a decade, maybe.
Yeah, no, it does seem really good. And look, the reason I wanted to talk to you again, because we spoke probably on the podcast a year and a half ago, and we had a really fascinating conversation at the time about this integration of health and buildings. Lots has happened in between then and now, but I wanted to tease that conversation out again, because it's something, we keep seeing a real push for this multidisciplinarity within the built environment at the moment, and health is front and center. It's a big mandate of ASHRAE this year, and we see it all over the place. Do you think that we're at this point where we can stop looking at buildings simply as shelter and start treating them perhaps more as a biological extension of ourselves in some way? And if that is the case, what does that start to look like? How do we start to see the built environment as an extension to human health and well-being? And will it change how we communicate what buildings are for, do you think?
You ask, can we manage buildings as an extension of our health, as a component of caring for our health? And I think, yes, we can do that. And we can talk about that. I think another question is, will we do it? And what are the obstacles and what are the opportunities? The opportunities seem clear. We can decrease acute and chronic diseases. We can make people more productive, increase, depending on your type of building, improve the financial model of whatever is within the building. But then there's the other question of, will we do it? And I think some of the obstacles are around, it's difficult to change. Human nature is somewhat resistant to change. Treating buildings as part of caring for health requires bringing the medical community into this discussion and into the management of buildings. And given at least in the US, the healthcare model, we're really a business of sickness in medicine. We don't prioritize prevention appropriately because it's not profitable the way our markets are set up right now. And so bringing medical personnel into this discussion is not the easiest thing. Having building managers and engineers and architects want to work with medical professionals is challenging. I think we're not the easiest group to work with, physicians. And then I think there are legal ramifications of talking about health. But all of the obstacles aside, I still firmly believe, and I hope I said this, Simon, the last time we talked, I believe that if we can really successfully manage buildings from the perspective of human health, it will be one of the biggest advances of our century.
Yeah. And, it's becoming a trope in these conferences and these organizations that we build buildings for people, buildings for health, healthy buildings, it's become the watchword within the sector. So I suppose that the question is, how do we move it from being a talking point and a blurb below a conference line to meaningfully thinking about a building from the perspective of the human inside it? Because I don't know how many years, you've been hearing it, but I don't know how many more years I can keep hearing that, human-centric building design and we build buildings for humans. Okay, well then let's start acting like it, rather than the thresholds and the metrics and the measurements of success being baked into real estate value and energy performance and aesthetic design and delight. Let's start measuring a success in the built environment through the thing that actually matters, the person that shelters inside it, right?
Absolutely. And I think defining that finish line has been challenging for building professionals. So from my perspective as a physician, the finish line has to do with human health metrics. Ideally, if we could have, and this is ideally and not realistically, if we could be continually sampling, for example, human biomarkers that are indicators of stress, and then having that feedback into the building, we would probably achieve optimal health, optimally healthy buildings. We're not doing that. We probably won't ever do that. So what do we do between treating buildings as environmental hazards to treating buildings as part of our healthcare toolbox? And I think, first of all, being realistic about health metrics being optimal health metrics being the finish line, and then sort of coming back from that ideal world and saying, what's realistic? Maybe we can use wearable data, heart rate, blood oxygenation, blood pressure, that kind of thing, but we're not there yet. So I think from my perspective, to actually implement this idea, we have to have a realistic finish line that is based in medicine. However, it's not intrusive like lab testing. So for me, that's a real shift in my experience with ASHRAE, my experience with other organizations. It's a shift to go from environmental pollutants, measuring and talking about even one or two environmental pollutants, to considering environmental pollutants in the context of temperature, humidity, holistically, and then applying modeling that is based on medicine. Yeah, I think defining the finish line and then rolling back from that to a point where we really are would be an advance.
Yeah, and I know it's making me chuckle because there was a great round robin happened recently amongst a bunch of academics trying to determine how we would define indoor environmental health. And it's surprisingly difficult to define what good looks like, even in simple words, because words carry so much meaning. And it's a really interesting challenge when we start trying to describe what good looks like, because that's the first challenge, isn't it, that you have to put before people. You say, well, okay, we're putting people in the center of this discussion, health in the center of this discussion. Tell me what good looks like, right? And
you want me to tell you what I think good looks
do,
like?
by all means. Yeah. What does a good indoor environmental health look like?
So good looks like an indoor space that does not increase our physiological stress level. I mean, that's a mouthful in a way, or at least implementing that's a mouthful. But what it means is not only measuring or diminishing hazards, but also diminishing components of the indoor environment that cause physiological stress for any of us, for each of us.
When you say physiological stress, you're meaning the physical stress on the body?
Yes, stress on our cardiovascular system, our respiratory system, our neurological system, our immune system. So, for example, when COVID hit, we started focusing on whether or not a building might contain bioaerosols that were infectious. So specifically SARS-CoV-2. So we really started looking at exposure to hazards. However, what we didn't look at, and we haven't looked at, is sort of the opposite side of that equation, which is what are our indoor environments doing to our immune system? As you and I have talked about, Simon, if you go into battle, say in the gladiator age, you want to have the weapons to get the enemy, but you also don't want to go into battle naked. You want to have your armor on. You want to have the protective layers that we are lucky enough to have in the form of our immune system. So when we talk about buildings as shelters or places we inhabit, we don't want to be harming natural human immunity. So one of the definitions of physiological stress in my mind is is taking steps to enhance our immune system. So that would be like one dimension of good, a building that supports your immunity.
Isn't there a couple of oxymorons built into that kind of a position, though, in the sense that, for example, we know immunity is built through stress, right? And to a certain point, then it will be negative, but we need to be exposed to the microbiome, for example, in order for our body to register harm and be able to protect us from it in future. Things like resilience, so you can make a very strong argument that actually a space that's very benign is unhealthy for the human body because it's not stressed. It doesn't have to work very hard, and ultimately then more likely to have cardiovascular disease, right? And obesity if you're living in a constantly benign, comfortable space. There's definitely something healthy about being challenged as a human body. So this is complex. We at a simple level we can say physiological stress and kind of understand instinctively that we don't want to be exposed to formaldehydes and toxins and things that there's no safe limit for. That stuff's quite easy. I think it's a slam dunk. But this is where I get really worried about the term indoor environmental quality. It wraps so many factors into one term, and some of them are more complex than others. It's not just about thresholds and toxicological impact or epidemiological impact. Some of this stuff's about comfort and resilience and stress and all sorts of different things. So it's a really complex space, isn't it, when you start unpacking it?
It's complex, yes. It's also confusing, I think. And so when I talk about stress, I don't consider immune system development a consequence of stress. I consider immune system development a consequence of training. So yes, you want your immune system to be trained from birth, really, or probably maybe even before birth. We now know that there are microbes in the, intrauterine space. So we want our immune systems to be trained through exposure, through rolling around in the soil, through hanging out with your dogs, and maybe not really your cats, but anyway, your dogs.
Let's not start the cat dog war, Stephanie, this early on in the podcast. We might leave that one till later.
But we do want to have a diverse microbial exposure from an early age. So to develop what's now called our microbiome. And we can do that by having a diverse microbiome in buildings. So I consider that immune system training. When I use the word stress, I'm talking about, for me anyway, I'm talking about imperceptible challenges to our skin barriers, to our respiratory tract barriers, to our cell functioning, to our genetic reproduction, DNA, RNA. So I consider stress things that challenge our basic health. But you were talking about, what about challenges, I think, as I heard you, Simon, challenges to our physiology that actually would strengthen us. So going to the gym is sort of a stress, but that's it. That's not an imperceptible stress. That's something that we can feel. We choose to do it or not to do it. So I think it's, for me, when I talk about harmful stress, they're the imperceptible forces that degrade our natural defense mechanisms. I don't know if that makes any sense. And then you might say, well, that's different for everybody. If I'm, a newborn, I'm going to have different responses to stress than, say, a 20-year-old football player versus somebody who's immunocompromised. So yes, I think we have to take into account in our buildings and in our definition of stress where people are coming from.
And I think this is a really fascinating example of kind of the premise of the first question, and that is this idea that when we start communicating about buildings as an extension of health and well-being, or illness and vulnerability and so on and so forth, it's a different language. It requires us to think, particularly as engineers, in a different way. And I think that's where the challenge is in all of this, isn't it? That clearly, when you spend so much time in the built environment, I mean, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's a societal contract with the built environment that it has a purpose. It's there to provide shelter and to protect us from harm, and to provide a stable space for us to flourish and perform and to function. That's the intent of the built environment. And somehow, well, objectively, we've failed in that contract. Buildings either are actively harming us or failing us to protect us from the stuff outside that they were designed to do. We've lost sight of that somehow. And it's become an engineering problem to solve, a unit cost problem to solve, an aesthetic problem to solve. And it stopped becoming a function and extension of human health and well-being, which is what shelter is at its most fundamental level. You know, unless we're building a building to store servers for AI, that's a different type of building. The vast majority of the built environments fundamental purpose is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But we've now got this entire ecosystem of language built around the engineering, the value, the cost, the design, and all of that. But we haven't built in parallel a way to communicate its impact on us effectively enough. And that's why I think we struggle to communicate this. And that's kind of where the medical community need to come in and support us, I think, in helping to bridge those gaps and find common ground and common language. You know, and we saw that so bluntly during the pandemic, didn't we, where instinctively everybody in the built environment knew what airborne meant, but the ramifications of the term airborne meant something so much different to people in the medical community. They were very fearful of recognizing the airborne nature of it because it has huge downstream consequences to how you manage spaces, right? So that was a really good example of that fundamental difference in language and communication coming to bear in such a dramatic way. But that's happening at almost every layer of this conversation, isn't it, between medicine and the built environment?
Yes, I think that's a great example. And I think the reason, or one of the big reasons anyway, that buildings have disconnected from being truly health supporting is that we design things and we design buildings and we respond to environments as we can perceive them. So initially, we wanted to keep the rain and the snow off of us as human beings. And then we wanted to be warm. We don't want to see mold. So we have relied on perceptible metrics. And unfortunately, or fortunately, but right now I think more unfortunately, a lot of the imperceptible forces indoors or imperceptible exposures are the ones that are causing us problems.
Yeah.
So I think that has been the disconnect. And now we're at an era when we have these tools. We have genetic analysis tools that have been brought into building assessments, PCR, polymerase chain reaction, that's originally was from medicine. We have these tools that are allowing us to measure some of these imperceptible forces. But we don't always know what they mean, at least not holistically, and we don't know what to do with them. So I think it's as we've moved from things we can perceive, designing buildings for things we feel or smell, or, in the case of COVID-19, we were very fearful, understandably, of the sort of invisible, bioaerosol virus. And so we ventilated and wore masks, even though we can't smell it or see it. But I think in general, we've neglected the imperceptible exposures that are very consequential to our health. And so what do you do about that? Well, in my world, you monitor them. You use our evolving capability to monitor these factors so that we can then control them. And so that's brings us to the whole discussion of sensors and monitoring and what do you monitor? And
or even at a more fundamental level, the concept of the autonomic functions of both the human and potentially the building, which I think is a fascinating crossover. There are imperceptible risks and stressors that the body is exposed to, that it has automatic responses to, that you don't know are happening. Your gut microbiome, your cardiovascular system, your adrenal response, your endorphin response, at all these different levels, the body is automating responses to changing environments and threats and risks and stresses. So there's a lot of analogies there, isn't there, to the built environment? And if we're going to treat the built environment as an extension of health and well-being, then you can understand how leaning into automation makes an awful lot of sense. If there are things that we can measure and sense and control automatically, that becomes an extension of the autonomic concept, doesn't it, in some way?
Absolutely, Simon. I wrote a paper 15 years ago for an automation company called Give Your Hospital an Autonomic Nervous System. And what I meant by that was control the very basic elements that can be hazardous to your health through automation and leave some of the comfort-based or perceptible components to occupant choices. But yes, just like our body, I think buildings need to, if we can, have automation that protects the occupants from health hazards. And we do already to some extent, fire alarms or, depending on your building. But I think using the human body and human physiology or mammalian physiology as a model is great because, number one, it works. We've evolved to be as we are. People understand it, and it really does apply to the building ecosystem. So if that makes any sense.
It does. And people get sick to death of me analogizing with the automobile industry, but there's so much crossover here. It's hard not to be honest. We exist in a world of automobiles now that are automating an awful lot of the processes on our behalf for our benefit, both from a health and safety and from a delight and a controllability perspective and an efficiency perspective. There's so much going on behind the wheel of a car that we have no clue what's happening. Yet we're given this profound sense of agency in an automobile that ultimately it's up to us how fast we go, how quickly we brake, what direction we end up going in, whether we roll a window down or not. We can air condition a car multi-zoned, it's such a small box. You could have like 6 zones of air conditioning or something ridiculous within that space. So there's a huge level of automation, yet you're given there's a huge science to the sense of agency. And this seems to be where there's a huge gap. I get the sense that technically we have the skills and knowledge today to automate almost everything that we need to think about when it comes to indoor environmental health in a built environment.
Oh my gosh, that's absolutely fascinating.
But we're so far from where the solution that the automobile offers up to us, that there's a huge gap there, and we're still stuck on thresholds. We're still stuck in the automobile where the red light comes on because the oil's run out, not because the viscosity has got thick and it knows you need a service, right? We've got all of this technology and we're still offering up that agency and that user experience like the cars of the 1950s did. That's my sense of it.
I've thought about cars being microenvironments where the safety of the car, if an 18-wheeler rolls over on top of you, you'd like your teenager to be in a car that has good safety metrics, right? Or any of us for that matter. So I've thought about cars from that perspective, but I've never thought about cars being an amazing balance between automation for essential safety and, as you call it, the agency of humans. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and mostly because actually I've found myself in a couple of scenarios that have supposedly been the pinnacle of build design and have offered up some glaring gaps from where we are. One of them was in an opening of a platinum badged building. You can make the links yourself in one of the most prestigious cities on earth and one of the most prestigious roads on earth, and it failed objectively to deliver good air quality on the very night that they were giving awards and saying how good the air quality was. And then just last week, I was in the centre of London, 150 Holborn Street, which is a very well-known building in London. At the time, one of the smartest buildings in London. It's won all of the smart buildings awards and LEEDs and platinums and all of that stuff, and everything going for it. And I was in a healthy buildings conference, and you had a room of 100 or so healthy building experts sat in one of the most advanced buildings in central London, stewing in a fog of their own breath for about 4 hours. I walked in at the end of the day, and the CO2 was at nearly 3,000 parts per million in that space, in a room that was clearly designed to cater for more people than was in there. So a huge failure of intent of that space. But what was stood out to me was the fact that you had all of that technology. This was a building managed by Siemens and every tech that you could imagine, all pinnacle of the stuff. But you also had a disconnect of the humans in the space as well, that people that should have known better were sat there in a space that was clearly poor. And it wasn't like it deteriorated around them. They were in and out all afternoon, and, people were clearly moaning about the stuffiness of the space. But how we could find ourselves in a position at the pinnacle of the built environment, effectively, in a space where people that should know better were accepting intolerable air quality in a space like that. And I think it really shows where we are, frankly, that gap exists. And I struggle to imagine the automobile industry accepting that it wouldn't be. Brand reputation would be dirt. That would be back to, there'd be refunds required for the vehicle. There would be, stuff going up the chain and quality control and data being assessed. And, you can well imagine an awful lot going on. Yet somehow in the built environment, there's this cognitive dissonance almost between the more automated a space gets, the less agency we feel we have over controlling it, to the point that you can get 100 experts in a space not able to control that space. It just seems bananas to me.
So what do you think failed there? Because to me, that sounds like an operational failure, not a conceptual failure. But so I'm just wondering, you're one of the most informed people I know about just, where we could be, in terms of health, and yet where managing buildings really is. I mean, this is your world. So what do you see as a failure there?
Yes, it's a really good question. I think this leads back into this idea of humans being an extension, buildings being an extension of human health and well-being, is that a building that operationally fails has to be seen as a failed building. Whereas at the moment, we classify a building's success or failure at handover and its design intent. We have to, if buildings are going to deliver healthy environments, the only metric that matters is the metric in the now. It doesn't matter whether that building's 6 months old or 5 years old or 15 years old. The intrinsic value of that space is how as it performs in the moment. If we're truly going to have buildings that are designed for human health and well-being, and that's the failure of most spaces. There are no ongoing, we do not hold buildings accountable in the moment, in the same way that we would hold a car accountable in the moment. I need to know when I press the brakes that the ABS is going to work, right? Or I need to know that the fog lights are going to come on if it's foggy, right? And we have checks and balances to make sure that happens, particularly as vehicles age. And we don't have that in the built environment. You know, we have the brake equivalent with fire tests, right? There are the life safety critical things that happen to buildings, but beyond those very few handful of metrics that we test on a regular basis, almost everything else that contributes to poor long-term outcomes is never measured again. And I think that's the failure, and that's how you can have a building that was cost multiple millions of pounds on handover, has an entire floor dedicated to showing how great it is. You know, it's one of those buildings that's got a display on the second floor with all the screens and stuff showing how amazing it is, that you can end up with a space that fundamentally fails its only objective, which is to manage 100 people safely. And as I pointed out in the room, you know, the best case scenario for the people in that space was that a couple of them went home with tickly coughs that they probably didn't deserve to have. But that's the best case. The worst case is that some of those homes had vulnerable people in them that can't afford to have somebody coming home with a tickly cough from being exposed, right? So this stuff really matters, and we've got to find a better way of holding existing buildings accountable, I think, if health is generally going to be central to this conversation.
I think you're absolutely right. And again, I think the disconnect and the problem lies with indoor conditions that we don't perceive, you know, that are, or perhaps we can perceive, but we can't do anything about. But because with your car, if your headlights aren't working, you know, you come to hopefully at nighttime, you come to a standstill pretty quickly. So we have the visibility in a car. If you're driving and you're experiencing a shimmy in your steering wheel, you know there's a problem. So the problems are perceptible, or an alarm goes off. You know, if you have low tire pressure, you get the yellow light, or if you're overheating, you get the red light. But I think we have not had or implemented solutions that give us visibility to the hazards in buildings. And the situation you just mentioned, people were probably getting sleepy, so that was an indicator that CO2 was too high. Maybe people smelled odors they didn't want to smell. But my guess is there were other contaminants that were less perceptible that were causing problems.
Some are compound, aren't they? You know, some of these pollutants, you know, are ones that there are no acceptable limits to. So you're just adding to the total exposome of your life in a space that shouldn't be adding to that, you know? Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think the challenge comes, and I think this is where your lens has been really interesting in it, both previously with work you were doing with the health index, but now with the new organization you're in, looking at these outputs and these control metrics from the human perspective and going, well, okay, then if we are going to put the human at the center, how do we tease out what do these metrics look like, and what are their impacts on human health? How do we measure that? And what are the levers we can pull if we detect that we need to change something? And that's been a journey you've been going on for many years, isn't it, Stephanie?
Absolutely. And it's funny, I got to where I am with working with ASHRAE and engineers and designers, and sort of, in my opinion, in the best possible way, which was I was looking at patient outcomes in a hospital and using the human experience in terms of healing, in terms of blood tests, blood cultures, vital signs. But I had a massive amount of detailed data on the occupant, the patient. And I was able to correlate the clinical data with environmental monitoring. So I started this by really in the best case scenario, which was having the human data and the correlating positive and negative health outcomes with what was going on in the building. And that's when my work, and that was my first experience with the hazards of very low relative humidity and how that was correlated with higher infection rates, known as healthcare associated infections in the acute healthcare setting. So yeah, I came into this in the most ideal way, which was here's the human data and let's correlate it with environmental data. But that was a unique and rare opportunity. Those data points are hard to get even from hospitals. So how do we move from where we are with building management and what we know or we think we know about buildings and human health? How do we move forward to achieve a building that truly does support human health?
It's amazing how many stories I've heard from people in the medical community that have gone on this journey into the built environment. And there are a few. There certainly needs to be more, but it always stems, it seems to me, from this idea of medicine hitting a wall, and at some point somebody stopping and going, somebody explain to me why the environment isn't a good story for the symptoms that I'm seeing before me, or the patterns that I'm seeing before me, or the outcomes that I'm seeing before me. And it seems to be people like you that at some point in their career are seeing patterns or outcomes or symptoms that just don't track. And at some point a light bulb goes off and go, is this an environment thing? Like, what's this person being exposed to? That's a story as old as time, it seems, in the medical community.
Oh my gosh, you're so right. And just right now in talking with you, I'm sort of realizing how important education is, because in medical school you're taught very little about the environmental impacts of health. Environmental hygiene is not, maybe it's an elective, but it's not a core topic. So I think education is a huge part of it. But I've been amazed from my current perspective of, being trained in architecture and being a physician, how even illnesses such as cystic fibrosis, where the mucus in your respiratory tract becomes very thick, as well as in your digestive tract, and concomitant with that very viscous mucus, you have a lot of pneumonia. And speaking of the respiratory tract, you have a lot of bacterial infections. So one of the big drivers of that is just the viscosity of your mucus. So how do you decrease the viscosity? Add water vapor to inhaled air. And yet the number of pulmonologists I've spoken with who actually recommend safe humidification to their patients is like negligible. And yet it's a very beneficial intervention. So instead of just coming into the hospital periodically and getting broad spectrum antibiotics and having PT, being able to prescribe something as simple as a humidifier in your bedroom would be very beneficial. And yet we're not taught that.
Yeah. And we need the medical community to come into the fight here as well. I mean, so it's incredibly important. Is the challenge here the headspace within the medical community, that it's so under resourced, the amount of time, particularly at a general practitioner or a general physician's perspective and the coalface, they get such a limited amount of time with patients to be inquisitive, to systems think and critical think their way through problems. I know in my part of the world, you're lucky to get 5 minutes with the general practitioner. So you've barely had a chance to run through the single main ailment that probably drove you to go and visit in the first place. You never actually get to the long list of other things that you kind of put up with that might actually be a clue to an environmental risk that you're starting to face. And so there is that challenge, isn't there? That, it's a real machine, and particularly that, in America, where it's a sickness care system as opposed to a healthcare system. And there's many countries that are like it as well. I'm not singling the US out here. That it's very difficult to think holistically in that way. That, like the thing that you mentioned there was cystic fibrosis. There's many illnesses where there's some pretty straight lines to environment and outcomes, but a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, particularly with chronic health, it is very grey. You know, that might present as symptoms that could be any number of things, including environmental conditions, and it takes time and thought as a practitioner to work your way through that and to be educated and to think about some of the other things that might be causing it. This is not a small task, is it, for the medical community to put itself into a position where it can find the time to say, back to my original kind of question, tell me why the building isn't a good story for what I'm seeing in front of me.
I mean, you're right. Time pressure is a huge problem in medicine. And again, that's a sort of a business model. As much as necessity. But, you know, there was a period where all of a sudden we needed to ask kids about parents whether or not their kid was wearing a bicycle helmet. Do you have guns in your house? Are they locked up? So you can have questionnaires. You can have sort of a built-in part of your patient interaction that is around environmental safety. So yes, it takes a little bit more time, but I think we just haven't focused on that. It hasn't been taught to people. We don't say, do you have a hygrometer in your house? And if so, what is your humidity reading? That's just not something we're taught to ask.
Or even fundamentally, do you have any signs of mold in your property? You know, some of this stuff doesn't even require a technical or a digital output. It can be a visual cue that we forget to ask. You know, do you feel like your home is stuffy or damp, or, you know, do you see mold? These are questions that don't get asked enough. So there's a gap to bridge, I think.
There's a very big gap. And if we could go back to the automobile topic for a minute, you know, when I was buying a car for my teenage son back when back a couple 10 or so years ago, you know, I looked into the safety specs of the car, you know, crash metrics and, you know, rolling over and center of gravity. And so if we could bring those sort of metrics and that sort of visibility into our buildings, it would be phenomenal. So when you go to buy a new house, you know, it's not only like, how does it look? And, you know, whatever people look at when they buy a house, but, you know, what are the asthma rates, or what are the change in asthma rates in this house, or bring into our awareness health metrics associated with buildings. And it's been sort of missing.
And often at some level, and I often talk about this, that the buildings are interesting because there's often only so many levers we can pull in a building as well. You know, as complex as air is, and indoor environmental quality more so in the whole, and the potential thousands of conditions that might result from poor environments, often there's only a handful of levers that we have at our disposal within a building anyway. So it's just, you know, as complex as we can make this sound, sometimes it's just a case of better ventilation, better filtration, you know, more daylight, you know, not too much noise, openable windows. You know, some of this stuff is real fundamental engineering that solves a lot of these problems. So as fascinating as a kind of a high level conversation this is for you and I, practically on the ground, sometimes this just means caring enough to make sure that the ventilation can be turned up in a room full of 100 people, you know.
But I think, yes, we only have so many levers we can pull, but I think sometimes we're pulling the wrong ones. And again, in my simplistic way of viewing things, the world, buildings, we need visibility. We need to know what is going on. So in the example that you gave where all the experts were sitting around in this building with carbon dioxide of 3,000, if there were monitors that actually showed that, people might have been going like, we need to dilute this. whether it's from outdoors or hopefully outdoors. But I think, in my opinion, the first thing we need is to create greater visibility around the metrics that impact human health, that we can't see, smell, taste, touch.
Yeah.
And if we have that visibility, and that's why I'm, work so closely with a sensor company that's fantastic, is it gives you the ability to know at least which levers you would like to pull. But if you don't have the visibility, we only have a few levers, but if you pull the wrong ones, you're just making things worse.
And I think that's a really great segue actually into ThinkLite, because what I think has been really interesting about your move over to ThinkLite has been not only bringing your knowledge and work you've been doing on the human building interaction and some of the metrics that we spoke about last time, and we should talk about them again here, but the what next questions that get solved with ThinkLite as well. So perhaps for people that aren't familiar with ThinkLite and your work, if you were meeting somebody for the first time and trying to explain what this idea is, what the kind of the grand idea of measuring, basing it on the human, and then putting levers in place to have an impact on that, how do you describe what you're doing with ThinkLite and the work that ThinkLite are doing?
So my elevator pitch, I guess, is what you're asking me.
Kind of, yeah.
That as a medical advisor for ThinkLite, our goal, our mission, our vision is to create indoor spaces that truly support human health through sensors to visualize the current conditions. So indoor air quality sensors. ThinkLite has amazing sensors. Number one. Number two, with real-time, ongoing, continuously accumulated data, how do you analyze those data points to give you a health index, something that reflects the impact of the indoor environment on the human body in a way that's relevant and not overwhelming and not, this accurate. So with ThinkLite, we measure with sensors. The software in the dashboard gives you a reflection of system by system impact. So what is the impact of this space on your lungs, on your brain, on your, every system, your reproductive success, both acutely and chronically. And then thirdly, once you know what's going on from a health perspective, what do you do about it? And again, that's another thing I love about ThinkLite, is that we make or have, the filtration devices, have remediation solutions, humidification requirements that allow you to optimize the indoor environment. And so it's seeing what's going on, analyzing the data in a way that is relevant for the human body, and thirdly, remediating.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that for me is, and it's what caught my attention when I initially spoke to you, is this idea of data without purpose is just noise. That one of the challenges the built environment has, particularly with visualizing data from the built environment, is once the geek who quite likes the ziggy-zaggy lines on the screen loses interest, often people are left wondering what value environmental monitoring is really bringing to them. And I think one of the things that you've tried to do, which I think is really interesting and very hard, I think, is turning arbitrary data points into relevant health metrics.
Absolutely.
And that's where I'm not saying it's the solution, but it's definitely an angle that's worth trying, because clearly what doesn't work is yet another ziggy-zaggy line on a dashboard somewhere nobody logs into, right? We've got to find a better way of visualizing and creating value in those data points.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I would call data without proper analysis noise, but at the very least, it's overwhelming, and nobody's going to voluntarily walk into that.
I'll have you back to the podcast in just a minute. I just wanted to briefly tell you about Eurovent Certified Performance from Eurovent Certification, a partner of the podcast. We all know HVAC systems play a vital role in improving indoor air quality. However, there is a risk that some products may not live up to expectations. Even the best installed and maintained HVAC equipment can underperform if data used to specify products and design systems is incorrect. Consequences can include poor indoor air quality, increased energy consumption, increased maintenance, system failure, and non-compliance with regulations, and that's bad for everyone. However, there is a way to ensure products perform as advertised and deliver good sustainable indoor environments. Selecting products holding Eurovent certified performance ensures that the manufacturer data has been independently and impartially verified. Eurovent certification's stringent certification process not only guarantees product performance, but energy efficiency too. I met some of the Eurovent certification team back in January at the Indoor Air Quality Matters conference and was seriously impressed with what they're trying to do. Their core aim is to create transparency in the industry by making certified data freely available. This means you can directly compare the performance of products to make informed decisions. Their certified product directory holds vital information on everything from air handling units to air filters. So don't take a chance on unverified products. Trust in proven performance. Details, as always, in the show notes at airqualitymatters.net and at Eurovent Certification. That's www.eurovent-certification.com. Now, back to the podcast.
Some health risks are acute and binary and pretty obvious. You know, we don't want carbon monoxide to be above a certain level or radon to be above a certain level. And so some of this stuff's pretty slam dunky when it comes to a red light flashing and telling you air is bad, air is good. But some of this stuff is a lot more nuanced, particularly the combinations of environmental conditions and impacts on chronic impacts to different systems. This stuff gets quite nuanced and risks being woolly at worst, doesn't it? How have you battled that challenge of looking at the complexity of the sensor data that we are able to measure currently, and turning that into valuable health metrics that aren't just health washing, for want of a better word, you know, producing a metric that nobody can stand over?
The solution to that complexity is clear analysis and clear communication of your analysis. So if you're in an environment that, say, has low humidity and high particles and heaven forbid ozone, analyze those metrics holistically or in combination and show your risk for respiratory distress, or if you have underlying reactive airway disease or asthma, your risk of having an asthma attack is increased significantly. Present that, show, on a dashboard or on a TV screen, if that's what you want to do. Show, communicate, educate people. Look, you're in an environment that is hazardous in the here and now. And then ideally, just like with, say, radon, you don't really smell radon. You don't have an immediate coughing attack. You don't fall asleep. The consequences of radon are down the road, some period of time, depending on the levels. So I think being able to create visibility around both acute and chronic health impacts and communicating that in a way that people understand.
Yeah.
And in some airports, you see plants dying. And I always think when I see that, like, if that plant isn't surviving, I wonder what VOCs are coming in from the idling airplanes. Some airports just change their plants pretty frequently. I've spoken with operators around that. It's like, what do you do when the plants start wilting? Well, we just change them out.
Yeah. Well, that's usually that's probably a good sign that either me and my wife have been put in charge of a house plant is its health status, because we are notoriously. I think anybody that's watched my podcast for long enough will notice a fairly regular cycling of plants in this room because of my
Oh, that's
my
funny.
inability to keep a plant alive. But anyway, that's another. I'm down to, if anybody can see over my shoulder, spider plants now. I think on the wide view you'll see it. I'm kind of down to spider plants at this stage because they're almost impossible to kill. That's the theory anyway. That and a bit of ivy hanging up there somewhere. In fairness, this is a north-facing room, so it's a bit. I think it's the daylight tends to get them. Sorry, a massive aside there, but no, you're right. I think it's really interesting, isn't it? This kind of finding a balance between useful information and pretending to be precise when you can't, particularly with lower cost sensors, with metrics you can't possibly determine that might happen 30 or 40 years time, because this environment might only be one part of a contribution to an overall health outcome. So there's always a challenge in presenting health orientated environmental conditions. And also a challenge. I was always fascinated with Joseph Allen's take on this, which kind of stemmed from, I think, his perceived risk over the transition from occupational or industrial hygienists to APs and low cost sensors and so on, that it's very easy to say a building is healthy until you have to stand over it being healthy. Because there's a difference between having a green light on a dashboard and somebody getting sick and then blaming you for saying, well, you told me my building was safe. That there's a certain responsibility that comes with presenting a building as healthy.
Absolutely, Simon. And legal hazard. And, in this litigious society we live in, if, you say, well, my dashboard says that your respiratory health is optimized, and then somebody gets sick or has a COPD exacerbation and they call their lawyer. I mean, that's terrifying. And the fear, I think, of legal consequences has been something that's hampered just about every organization I've ever worked with. Hospitals getting data, ASHRAE talking about health. I mean, we're moving past that to some degree, but it's a huge responsibility when you start talking about health. And it also, unless quality control data is protected from the legal system, you put yourself at risk.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between saying a space is potentially harmful, and I use the word potentially advisably, and harmful advisably, and having a green light and saying you're all good to go, everything's safe, right? It's all in the language and what you communicate. But we saw the other side of that as well during the pandemic. There was huge fear when we were issuing CO2 sensors at scale that people were going to see, 1,200 parts per million of CO2 and entire buildings were going to be decamping, because people misinterpreted it as a risk where there wasn't one. And that didn't really manifest, not at any great level.
The COVID-19 and CO2, in some districts, parents were putting CO2 monitors in their kids' backpacks because they weren't really allowed to monitor openly. And sometimes the CO2 levels were alarmingly high.
Yeah, and I want to be really careful here not to cross over into the devaluing the risk of an environment, particularly to people that are vulnerable to those poor environments, and the very real risk that carries. But I think there's a difference from that to a teacher misinterpreting a CO2 sensor being at 1,500 parts per million and clearing the classroom out for the day. And that was a risk that was perceived at the time. But I think, and this is, I'd be interested in your perspective here, and because I think we've seen this with sustainability in trying to tread lines and to be not too specific. You can also create doubt, which turns into a weapon that bashes you over the head at some point. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, if we create benign statements about the health or not of an environment, we're never really very specific. We're just saying this may, this could, this, that, and the other. And we've seen that with sustainability, that you come up with kind of greenwashing, vanilla sustainability reports that don't really mean anything to anybody. And ultimately that's used as a weapon against sustainability, that it's just, for the champagne set that can afford to make glossy brochures about how wonderful their building is, and, the businesses with LEED platinum buildings and platinum buildings were always going to be good buildings. They're just rubber stamping something that probably was already going to happen. So I think there's a risk. I think there's a risk in that we'll have to navigate as we go forward, that when we start saying things,
the risk of what?
As we go forward and we start saying things about a space, that we do so in a transparent enough way that it's not used as a weapon down the road, that effectively it's just tech saying nothing about an environment that's meaningful, because we've seen that in sustainability used as a weapon for doing the right thing, and that for me, I can see that being a risk. And you see that in the arguments over something even as simple as CO2. The amount of arguments you hear about what a safe level is from different quarters of the same field, that argument's been going on for 20 years. It's interesting.
No, you're right, Simon. You're one of the most experienced people I can imagine in terms of the challenges and the opportunities in building management for health. But you're right that our solution, our interventions have to be scientifically and medically valid. And they have to be meaningful both to the occupant and meaningful from the perspective of, the financial health of a business or a building. I think it's very achievable, but it requires a shift in thinking from, are certain thresholds being achieved? I mean, if hopefully people are looking at that. So are certain environmental thresholds safe, to how do we analyze comprehensively from a health perspective and communicate that in a way that's both meaningful and actionable? I think it's very doable.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating for me is I know you think that same way too, and that's what fascinates me about what you saw in ThinkLite, actually, as you moved what you'd been doing with the kind of the health index work and brought that across to ThinkLite. I'm guessing there's something within the DNA of that organization that gives you enormous encouragement that they're heading in the right direction here on this stuff.
You're absolutely right. And it's the differentiation between something might be hard to do, but it doesn't mean that it's not doable or that we shouldn't try. But often in my many years of experience with people, different areas, if something's hard to do, it's devalued. Well, it's not important. Or I guess that's the main thing. So with ThinkLite, there's no sense of if it's hard to do, we can't at least try. And so that underlying mindset in culture is very prominent at ThinkLite. It's like this is the future, and we're going to try to get there. So combine that great attitude with fantastic hardware, great sensors, great air filter devices. And you kind of have a win-win situation, positive thinking and excellent hardware and software to back it up.
Yeah, and I got that sense talking to, I met yourself and Dinesh, I think's the CEO of ThinkLite, and clearly very technically capable, and had, with my limited knowledge of things like sensor hardware, all the right answers when it came to both the capabilities and limitations of the technology that's currently available, but also a real drive and a kind of an imagination to, like you say, solve the hard stuff, do the hard miles, because what nobody needs is yet another sensor company or yet another air cleaning company or filter company on the market. They're to a penny. The what you need is companies that are thinking outside the box. I was having a conversation with Adam Muggleton there a couple of days ago, and he was making the point that, you know, where are the Elon Musks? Now, I'm not a fan of Elon Musk, but where are the superstar innovators? Where are the next big leaps coming from? Who are the people that the young people can look up to and say, this is an exciting space or an exciting company to go into? We don't have enough of that in the built environment at the moment. And that's the risk for us, particularly into a world that's changing so rapidly at the moment with AI, that we need innovators and leaders and people that are prepared to think outside the box and look at the built environment in fundamentally different ways. And that's what's always really inspired me about our conversations, is just your completely different take of coming at this from a human-centered perspective, and what that means to every part of this, you know?
Simon, sometimes in my ASHRAE work or my work in general, I'll meet engineers and young engineers, and they'll say, well, I'm just an engineer, or I'm not wholly invested in what I'm doing. I'm beginning to lose interest. And I say, you're not just an engineer. The well-being of our species is in your hands, because the indoor environment is such a neglected and yet powerful tool for protecting health. So I think if building professionals can really realize how impactful their work is to public health, you know, it might invigorate. There might be more motivation or energy in this.
Yeah, I agree. But they're the front, you know, engineers are the front lines to this battle on human health and well-being in the built environment. They are the people that, with their bare hands and their minds and their knowledge, protect us.
Well, I think engineers, but don't forget about architects and builders.
Oh, yeah.
Another conversation that we haven't really had is how can materials contribute to safe indoor, not just pleasing, but safe indoor environments? Absolutely.
And there's some real fundamentals here. I mean, you know, you're into my favorite subject of the hierarchies of control. You know, this stuff around filtration and ventilation and UVs and all of that is third or fourth on the list of effective things you can do with your built environment to protect you. And source control and elimination and substitution of hazards is one of the most effective things we can do in our built environment. You know, just had a conversation with somebody yesterday about the amount of PFASs in construction materials, and without rhyme or reason either, that you can have the same types of material and some will have forever chemicals in them and some of them won't. So it's not a fundamental building block of producing that material. It's just that chemical has found its way in to that product, you know. So materials are huge in the space, but incredibly complex for people to navigate. Again,
another thing we haven't talked about, right, in this conversation anyway, is using buildings perhaps differently. And when you and I spoke somewhere, we were talking about, you know, the hierarchy of spaces in a beehive. So you know, where you put the queen bee in the center in the most protected environment, and then the worker bees around the perimeter. But I think if we really embrace the concept of building to support health, there may be a shift in how we use spaces. It may not be that everybody wants to have the corner office. You might want to say, hey, you know what? I want my office to be in the apple core, in the core of the building, where the, you know, humidity can be more easily controlled and safely controlled, or whatever. But I think as we move forward with designing, operating, and maintaining buildings for health, we may use spaces differently.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I remember coming away from that conversation actually with my mind buzzing of different concepts. I think it actually started because we were chatting about Esther Sternberg and some of the things that we'd been talking about. And,
yeah,
you know, from that conversation, I'd had lots of ideas about, you know, rather than spaces at a personal environmental level, you know, controlling the same space but in different ways for different people, that we curate the built environment for the different needs of people, as well as the different needs of the activities that are in there. You know, some people will, like you say, want a cozy, internal, warmly lit space. Other people will want a more freshly brighter blue light type of space to work in. Some people want to collaborate. Other people want to work individually. Some people want noise around them. Other people want silence. Do we need to think about the spectrum of human needs when we're designing these spaces? And I know some organizations do that really well. You know, LinkedIn's a good example of that.
But Simon, everything you just mentioned, those factors are perceptible. We can perceive them: silence, enclosure space. But what about having a hierarchy of spaces that's based on what you can't perceive? So, for example, in a hospital, you know, the Facility Guidelines Institute says every patient room in a new hospital should have views of nature. Well, my feeling about that is if I'm in a really cold environment where the consequence of having a view of nature is a window, and the consequence of a window is the indoor air is going to be very dry, so you don't get condensation, you know, that's not healthy. I'd rather have a hologram of a forest or beach on the ceiling or on the wall and get out alive without a new infection and go home and see nature. But some of our metrics are based on perception, not on the imperceivable hazards. And I think that's got to change. And I think that can change as we implement, you know, sensors and analysis for health, things that are impactful to our health, but we can't sense them with our body. But so when you were talking, I was thinking, but wait a minute, those are things you can choose. You know, you can choose noise, you can choose silence, you can choose whatever. But what about the things that you don't feel or sense?
Yeah,
and yet,
but you could, they could be signposted. You know, you may not see them or feel them, but you could walk. You could be presented with a choice of spaces that say this room is X, even if it's not perceptible. So you could well imagine moving into that space. It kind of makes me think that ultimately here, the ultimate monitor of whether a space is working is the human being themselves, if that is the ultimate measurement. And still we're stuck in this theoretical space where we're trying to measure environmental conditions and guess the likely outcome of a patient. Do you think we could get into a space where there are the perceptible biomarkers that would enable a space to adapt based on the impact it's having actually on people, rather than what a standard says or what we think an algorithm has dished up?
I think you meant the imperceptible, right?
Yeah.
I think we have the technology to do that. I think we don't necessarily have the buildings can't always, I mean, you know, often, most of the time, aren't set up that way. I think that could be the future. But I think it's really important that we accept where we are now, right? For example, you know, back to humidification is a good example. You know, if you try to maintain indoor humidity in temperate climates between 40 and 60%, many of your building stocks, many of your buildings would have harmful condensation. And, you know, Lou Harriman and I've talked about that, and Bill Banfleth, like, okay, you can say 40 to 60 is your ideal indoor range, but buildings can't accommodate that right now.
The question I was posing, it was kind of this idea of what does the future roadmap look like? And you can, one of the challenges that you see, particularly in developing the ROIs for investing in the right technology in buildings, is drawing the straight lines between spend and an outcome. You know, so a good example of that is the office space. There's a lot of talk about the cognitive impacts and the efficiency impacts of good environments on workers. So it's used as a tool to say, well, look, if you can improve the ventilation and you can make sure CO2 levels are low and air quality is good and lights are good and so on, you have a more, you know, cognitively alert a bunch of people working in your building, and it's more profitable. And there's this famous kind of 330-300 rule. You know, the vast majority of your spend as a business is on your people. So it makes a lot of sense that they're profitable and it works. Even at a basic level, absenteeism and illness and presenteeism and stuff. But the metrics and the measurements we use for cognitive performance and things like that are so woolly that it's very difficult for us to really pin down whether it's specifically the building that's making you more alert on the day, or whether it was the good night's sleep you had the night before, or whether it happens to be that you're just in that part of your cycle of a human being of being on it at the end of the month or not, whatever it is.
So wait, so you're saying that the complexity or the,
because we're not measuring we struggle to measure the person, and I think we can measure CO2 and carbon monoxide and ozone and things like that, and we can guess what the impacts might be chronically or acutely on the body, but the ultimate measurement has got to be the person. The whether it is, like you said at the beginning, an environmental stressor on that person in some way, but it's just interesting to ideate what that eventually might look like for people beyond screens and dashboards and monitors, that in some way the building is actually in tune with the people that are in those spaces.
Absolutely. And I think with biomonitoring, and when I say biomonitoring, I don't just mean I don't mean blood work and urine sampling and saliva testing, but even like the wearables. We're using our devices to measure heart rate and all that stuff. So I think one challenge is understanding the metrics that relate to health. But when you were just talking about an office building, and in my experience, what I've run into is, say, a commercial developer who says, I care what happens up to the interior walls. What happens beyond the interior walls? That's not my business. It's not something I'm going to profit from. That's up to the occupant. So then the occupant comes in, or the business owner, and they say, well, we don't have operable windows, or we don't have the capacity to alter the things that are going to affect our workers. So what I'm getting at is something that Joe Allen talked about, which is there are different stakeholders in with buildings. And so how do you create profitability that's seen by the most influential person from a financial perspective? How do you create profitability for those folks when the impact is on the occupant, who may be the most voiceless?
It's the complexity of the built environment. You're right. This is the challenge. We've got to speak to so many people with so many different perspectives. But the one thing that, I think does cut through everything so well is health, and at some level, I forget who kind of coined it with me. It was, they were saying, we don't consider fire alarms as a productivity hack. Like some stuff is a life safety system that it ascends above the value of a building, right? Or the profitability of the high value mammals inside the box. That at some level, some of this stuff, has to transcend that. And when a building is objectively harming us over our lifetime, and for me, like this is the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance here in these conversations, is that we know air quality is impacting millions and millions of people a year, and the vast majority of our exposure to even outdoor air will occur indoors. So back to this kind of Maslow's principle of the buildings are there to protect us. Fundamentally, we're failing that. Objectively, we're failing that. Indoor air quality kills more people every 2 weeks than all the global wars do every year in a typical year. Like the amount of people that die or are injured because of fire or structural collapse in buildings is virtually nothing. Yet we spend a magnitude more on that than we do air quality and health. So there's this huge dissonance to the impact of the environment on our long-term health and well-being, because it's long-term mostly. That's the trouble. And
well, I don't know if it's always long-term. Sometimes it's just invisible. Like I sometimes think about Wi-Fi. When I check into a hotel, for example, if I have to prepare presentation for the next day, which often I do because I do things last minute too much of the time, when I check into the hotel, I will specifically ask for a room that's close to the Wi-Fi, modem. I can't see it, but I perceive it. I think it's not always just long-term consequences that we're dealing with. There are acute consequences, but we can't sense them.
The reason it's impactful is because it's having an impact now. It's just accumulating over your life exposome and causing problems here. By the time it becomes manifests as a problem, it might be long-term. But the impact is now, with a lot of these pollutants. Good conversation the other day about the oxidative potential of particulate matter. One of the reasons it's so impactful is because your lung has a lining that protects against oxidative impacts of the air that it's breathing, but it's finite, and the more exposure you have to oxidative particulate matter and gases like nitrogen dioxide, the more it wears that down and the lower the barrier you have. So, although the impact might be COPD in 40 years' time, the breakthrough of that membrane is happening now, and that's the kind of the we've got to figure out how to communicate that better with people, that these exposures that we're putting ourselves in the built environment, whether we sense them or not, may not accumulate at a problem level until you're 40 or 50 or 70 or whatever, but it's happening now.
A good point. I'm wondering, Simon, what do you think? I'm going to turn this and interview you. What do you think a realistic building of the future could look like? Say, what would you like to see in, say, 5 years? In, I don't know, pick a building type. What do you think would be a step forward?
That the fundamentals are nailed, that we understand materials risk, not material risk, so that we understand that what the building is made of has a huge impact on our health, that we value engineering controls and they're seen like other life safety systems, like fire, that are checked regularly, that are serviced annually, that people walk around with pride in overalls, checking the ventilation system once a year, the same way they do the air conditioning system and the fire alarms, that this is something that engineers are proud to do and it's important work and it's understood. And we trust but verify, that we have the systems and we value it and the regulation has teeth, but we also verify that we have the quality processes in place that mean that buildings perform. Because my vision of the built environment, I'm far less interested in the platinum well LEED buildings. We're largely tinkering with buildings that should, quite frankly, be working anyway. I'm fascinated in how we get to a better place in the rest of the built environment. The offices above warehouses in the Midwest, the solicitors or hairdressers in the basement under a restaurant in downtown New York, the school in Western Ireland with natural ventilation, these basic spaces that have been undervalued for years for the really important role they have in people's long-term health and well-being. The systems that should be there to protect us are there, but because I see the built environment through the existing built environment lens mostly. The vast majority of the built environment already exists, and every time we look at this, we're getting it fundamentally wrong. And I'm fascinated by how we fix that.
So what do you think the next 2 steps would be? Is it education? Is it regulation, incentivizing?
I think a lot of it has to come through regulation and policing and control, because what we've learned in construction and the built environment is everybody obfuscates and complains and kicks up a fuss until the law comes in, and then they just get on and do it like it was never a problem. And that happens over and over and over again. So for me, I think a lot of that change comes with the political classes having the courage to do the hard thing. And because when they do, the moaning stops and everybody gets on and just does it. And it's different in different parts of the world, but we see it over and over again. When people are held accountable and they know they can be punished if it isn't, there are repercussions for not doing what you should do, people generally do it. We've seen it with scaffolding safety, with PPE, with fire safety control, with electrical safety, different measures in different parts of the world, and some countries do things better than others. But generally speaking, when a robust law is put into place, generally speaking, everybody just goes, right, okay, better do it then. And on a dime, an entire industry that's been screaming from the rooftops that this is going to destroy them goes, oh, okay. And they get on and do it,
That's so interesting. Yeah. I guess speed limits are another example from back to our road metaphor.
Every time. Yeah. I mean, a good example of that, there's a road outside our house, which is a big road, and a couple of kids have died on it in the last few years. There's a dangerous corner, and arguably it's a dangerous corner. And there's good reasons why it's dangerous, but kids make mistakes, and but what they've done is they've arbitrarily dropped the speed limit down to quite a low rate on the entire run of that road for 20 or 30 miles. And everybody's been up in arms about it, that it's an impossibly low speed to be driving along it. It feels like a motorway and you're driving at 80 kilometers an hour. And it's amazing. 6 months on from that speed limit, everybody's pootling along that road at 80 kilometers an hour as if it's always been thus, and everybody was moaning and it was the end of the world and it's going to take, an hour longer to get to where you're going. And they dropped the speed limit. They stuck a load of cameras along it and everybody's just stuck the cruise control on and just gone with it, and it's just so human nature. And the challenge with our built environment is most of those buildings exist. They're underinvested. You're not going to demonstrate an ROI for a school classroom to invest in ventilation system. You're not going to demonstrate an ROI for a business guy that's up against the wall trying to decide whether he's going to invest in forklift trucks or marketing next year with his limited budget to invest in a HVAC system. Those arguments you don't win. Yes, you win in a Deloitte headquarters building or a LinkedIn building somewhere, that you can make those cases, but the vast majority of the built environment, that's why we find it very difficult to sell tech into.
It's interesting. I think about this a lot. I lie awake at night thinking what are the best approaches for instigating change. And I agree with you, right? Top down through regulations is one effective approach. But then I also think there's a grassroots approach. And
yes, absolutely.
I think about mothers against drunk drivers, the MAD, MADD.
Yeah. And,
no offense to fathers, because fathers care too. But I think mothers against bad air, that's when there's a strong emotional drive to protect whatever, in this case, children. I think that's a piece that also can be effective, maybe in conjunction with regulation.
I think you're right. Yeah, for listeners, actually, there was a really interesting One Take episode I did last week, which was about the difference in purchasing decisions on air cleaners between a cohort in Portugal and a cohort in Germany.
Oh, you were telling me.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And the even within Europe, the difference between a Mediterranean country and a Germanic country, the difference in levers, in triggers that made purchasing decisions, or theoretical purchasing decisions anyway. So yeah, fairness and protective mechanisms and caring for people around you, and but also effectiveness of being sure that when you invest or do something that it works is really important. There's all these I think how we communicate stuff and present technology and solutions to people really matters. But we also have to accept that it's different for different people, and there are no silver bullets in the built environment. What's important to one group will be very different to another group. So that we have to be a little bit more sensible about how we communicate the importance of air quality. There was another one on the One Take episodes about trust, for example.
Do you think that anyone would say that occupant health is not important?
They do, but for example, one of the things that seems to come out of all the psychological work seems to be that personal vulnerability is a real turn-off for action. So when you describe air quality as a risk to people, the severity of the risk is important. So people relate to something being risky. COVID was a good example. That the risk to society was huge. My personal vulnerability is low. And that's how humans tend to relate. It's very similar for the home as well. So one of the things that seem to really come out of these studies is the cognitive dissonance of something harmful in the home, because we have a high perception of the home being a place of safety and well-being. You cannot tell people that a wood-burning stove is harmful to their health, because there's such huge association with family and snugness and warmth and the dog sleeping by the fire and all of these positive mental images. You're battling against huge psychological dissonance to a potential harm. So it's very rare that personal harm resonates, but often protective harm. So I'm protecting my children or my community or loved ones or family or colleagues is a driver. But not in all places. The interesting thing from the Portugal cohort was that didn't seem to move the needle for ventilation and air quality at all. What moved the needle for them was effectiveness. They wanted to know that if we spent money on this, that I could be sure it worked.
So they want to know that it works. So again, my sense is that if I have a wood stove and I live in northern Vermont, and I have the 5 dogs, I have the wood stove, and I like the smell of some cooking. But if, I know what I know now. So when I smell like delicious cooking, I'm like, hey, to my husband who does all the cooking, I'm like, could you please turn on the fan? But if people had a scale over their wood stove, like some kind of scale that said, yes, you might be snug and warm and have great associations with this crackling fire, but your risk of lung cancer has gone from X to Y, people might respond to that. So I think, again, it's education. I think it's visibility. You can see having the ability to do something about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, my personal story with my stoves was one of protective risk. The more I understood about them, the more risk I saw them presenting to my family. So
with what?
With wood burning stoves. So the more I understood about combustion in the home, the more I understood the risk it presented, particularly to my younger kids at the time. So one weekend I decommissioned all of the wood burning stoves and converted them to electric. Same stoves, just with a glowy light and an electric radiator behind them, giving off much less heat, but not doing the harm. And my family has never let me forget it, because they complain every single winter that the stove was never the same since Dad decided he was going to turn them off. So my perception of risk and doing the right thing was born out of, not because I was worried about me, but because I was worried about my family. From my family's perspective, they're not worried about themselves. They see a negative only. So risk is hugely complex, even within the dynamic of one family, as you know, and it just shows how hard this is to get right when we communicate air quality, that what works and resonates for one is not necessarily going to resonate for even somebody within the same household.
But again, your level of education about this, I presume, because, this is what you do all day and all day and all day. You probably think about this and are more informed than maybe your young kids. So I think education is hugely important there.
Although, as I've generally found, the person your child will listen to least is the parents. Yeah. If anything is going to get my kids to take up smoking faster, it will be me telling them not to smoke, right? So yeah, it's a very fine line, particularly with teenagers.
Maybe you ought to tie their allowance to the quality of the air they're inhaling.
Yeah.
Give them an ROI.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to get onto it just because, as usual, like we could talk for hours, but I did really want to touch on a conversation we had the last time we bumped into each other, which I think was in Las Vegas, and that was that you'd been starting to look at rethinking even the basics of risk, things like the Wells-Riley models, and starting to rethink about how you model potential harm. And I guess that kind of philosophical thinking feeds all the way into the work you're doing with the likes of ThinkLite, how you present that data and present risk. What was that again? Because I thought it was interesting. I thought it was worth bringing up. For those that don't know what the Wells-Riley model is, what is it and why have you been having a look at it?
Wells-Riley equation is something that was born from, I think, the 1970s when Wells and Riley were looking at measles outbreaks in a school. And they said, well, if your child is susceptible to the measles, this was about the measles, what are the chances that they're going to get sick? And that was based on the ventilation of the school. It was based on the infectivity of measles. It was based on, the respiratory rate of those kids. But the Wells-Riley equation is a very accepted metric used in infection control to say, given the infectivity of a bioaerosol in a given space with this ventilation rate, your chance of getting sick is X.
And for those that aren't initiated, that's where you might have heard during the pandemic things like the R value, where you're starting to use equations to figure out how much aerospace should need, how infectious this particular pandemic was, that kind of thing.
That term or not, which is based on the infectivity of a bacteria or virus. So in modeling indoor air quality and human health, I realized the importance, number one, of starting with something that people have confidence in, such as the Wells-Riley equation. So that was one part of my thinking about expanding on the Wells-Riley equation. So using that mathematical format to model, not only here's your exposure risk, here is your exposure risk from, you can expand from an infectious bioaerosol to a contaminant. So here's your exposure risk, but then also building into that equation the component of here is what indoor air quality is doing to your immune system, to your protective mechanisms, so that you're not just modeling, to go back to the warfare example, you're not just modeling how many weapons there are shooting at you. You're also modeling your ability to defend yourself. And indoor air quality impacts both. It impacts your exposure and it impacts your immunity. So in my work now at ThinkLite, we use that format to model not only exposure risks, but also your protective mechanism capabilities.
So you're kind of developing almost like a vulnerability metric based on the environment. So you put yourself through these particular pollutants in a particular space from a vulnerability perspective, which means the R value or the risk value of a particular pollutant will have a greater or lesser potential to cause you harm.
And it's a multiplier. It's not just additive or subtractive. It's actually a multiplier. So we have your immune susceptibility. We have cognitive susceptibility. So we've broken down, to make this relevant and accurate, we've broken down the exposure risks, not only from the exposure perspective, but also from what it's doing to your natural, robust physiology.
often with these things, particularly when it comes down to risk, adding another factor can multiply the complexity of the result inordinately, can't it? And that, is this stuff kind of testable? Are you in a position where you can start to try and model outcomes or even test outcomes from that kind of perspective? Because I remember somebody saying during the pandemic, particularly with the Wells-Riley model, they were saying, with the models that we have and the maths that we have, we can say with absolute 100% certainty that the risk is somewhere between 0 and 100%. And it was a flippant remark to say that, even in a space where we understand airflow and size and number of potential infection points, just changing the R value by a small factor can have a massive impact on outcomes. Or you can have an R factor, but you've no idea how many infected people are going to be in that space. So the small changes in critical parts of a formula can have wild impacts, can't it, in outcomes? So sometimes this stuff isn't just a case of adding another sliding scale to move. It can really complicate results.
Exactly. So what do you do then? You bring it back to the metric that you're interested in, which is human health, the health of the occupants. So one of the building sectors that we've been working with quite a bit is our senior living communities, because senior living communities are great because people are there like 24 hours a day generally. And elderly people tend to be vulnerable to air quality changes. And thirdly, the business model of a senior living community is aligned with keeping their residents out of an acute care hospital. So we've been able to go in and say, okay, we would like to monitor and remediate, and these are the outcomes we'll be measuring. The number of residents that go to an acute care hospital for a virus, the number of patients you'll need to spend money to put into quarantine, number of empty beds that you have to hold at a lower reimbursement rate. So the health outcomes are measurable, and the return on investment is measurable. And it's been incredibly impactful. I mean, I did a project actually during the pandemic in a senior living community in a temperate climate that was monitored and remediated, had about 60% fewer COVID deaths than another facility about half a mile away that was not monitoring or remediating. So ultimately, yeah, we can have these equations in Wells-Riley and bring as many variables in as you want or need to. But ultimately, what's happening to the people? What's happening to the occupants?
So in some ways, although some of the formulas might be the same, is it often just a case of shifting the orientation of the equation? Effectively, you're interested in a different result almost, which is the health outcomes is the final piece of the puzzle, or the focus. I'm probably not articulating that well. What I'm saying is that by shifting the human health as the outcome, somehow simplifies some of the complexity, perhaps.
Definitely. It gives you a clear finish line. And I think that's
an immeasurable one.
Immeasurable. And, different types of buildings, you'll have different health outcomes. Like a school, maybe it's the GPA, or a student's score from an exam taken in a certain classroom. Or if you want to pick a longer time frame, it'll be absenteeism over a semester. But choosing health outcomes that are measurable is really important.
Yeah, you could imagine in elderly care, kind of lung function might be an outcome that's measurable, or adult asthma control, or there's things that from a medical perspective you'd be able to measure that would be able to demonstrate the impacts of the interventions.
Or cognitive decline, because there are tests for the progression of Alzheimer's or other dementia. So correlating less decline with improved air quality is a very meaningful metric. I have done some of that in senior living, but there was a paper that came out about 6 months ago tying Alzheimer's progression to poor indoor air quality. So those are the types of studies I think that get people's attention. No pun intended.
Yeah, and it's back to almost a fundamental premise of business in a way, and that is, what actually matters and how do you measure it? Because that's how you measure the success of that particular approach. So it kind of brings us back full circle, I suppose, to the beginning of the conversation, is that when you orientate a building or the building's performance to health outcomes, it changes all of the questions that you ask almost. That it completely reorientates why you're doing this, and perhaps sets up the systems in order to measure that effectively, as opposed to, constantly battling, trying to tie air quality to energy, as a good example of where we are at the moment. Often our success or failure for HVAC systems is, did it save any money on the running cost of the fan? That's a good example of measuring the wrong thing.
Exactly. And, so when in our conversation, Simon, you are really great at seeing all the variables and how difficult it is to sort out what's important, what's not important, what might be confusing the picture. But from my perspective, maybe I think simplistically, I think it's fairly straightforward. I think we have to differentiate between what we can do and what's hard to do, number one. Number two, I think we need to clarify our finish line. So again, from my perspective, it's health, it's occupant health. To clarify that finish line and to get there, we need to bring in the medical professionals. But I also think it's really important to create visibility around the metrics that we can't perceive. And the only way I know of doing that right now is using sensors and then having the capability to remediate to the threshold that you're aiming for. So create good, healthy, an optimal health index. And then, do enough studies where you correlate the good health index with whatever your outcome is, absenteeism or lack of Alzheimer's or decreased asthma. And then for the real world aspect, show the return on investment of that. So I don't think it's that hard to do. And I don't even think conceptually it's very challenging, but I think getting people to shift their thinking, as well as, the building stock doesn't easily, we have to accept the fact that our buildings might not be able to achieve these optimal levels. And as you were saying, how do we bring the basics into our everyday buildings in a way that moves us in the right direction? But I don't think it's that complicated. I think it's just kind of hard.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is hard, but it's recognizing where those challenges are going to be. One of the challenges we see very regularly is in buildings that are performing pretty well, the value of the thing that delivers it is devalued over time. And what I mean by that is, if you're just looking at a bunch of sensors on a wall and they're constantly green, after a while you wonder why you bother having a sensor there, right? What's the value of measuring it? And we see that. We see people falling off of standards. They might look to achieve a well building standard or a LEED standard when the building is open, but after a few years, is anybody interested in whether it met that anymore? So the challenge when we start to do the right thing is constantly showing that the reason why we're doing this, without that being devalued. And perhaps health is the jigsaw piece of the puzzle that enables us to do that, because we can show it gives us a better chance to show the positive impacts of doing the right thing. Because otherwise, after a while, you just have a building that what's a perfect building from a ventilation and air quality perspective? Well, it's a ventilation system you can't hear, that's largely invisible from an infrastructure perspective, that consistently delivers good air, that you have to barely get involved in because it's automated and works in the background, it might as well not be there. So at some point, if it's doing its job, you don't know it's there. So how do we maintain the value of that over time? And I think that's been one of the big challenges of monitors and air quality in the healthy building movement, is that we convince a champion to take air quality seriously in a building or an asset or a series of assets. That person moves on, as is often the case, and you're left then with nobody championing your cause. And if your business model has been, service based or annual based or whatever it is, all of a sudden you're in a meeting and your business is dropped because nobody sees the value of it anymore. And perhaps health is the answer.
I think it is. I think, with the plaque or the certification, that's a static thing. That's like, okay, 3 years ago, my building was platinum. But I think what's needed is the ongoing visibility. And again, it's like with your car, you could plaster a sticker over your fuel gauge that's always full, right? You might be like, well, I'm not really going to look at that sticker anymore. But if you peel it off and you see underneath your fuel tank is getting empty, and then you come to a grinding halt, you're going to pay attention to that. And so again, I'm not advocating that we create buildings where people die. That's the halt. But buildings where we have the visibility around, a trusted visibility around what the air is doing to your health, short-term and long-term.
Well, certainly the work that you're doing at ASHRAE helps that. I think being involved with leading companies like ThinkLite are showing the way of how to implement that on the ground. You're an amazing voice in this space, as always, Stephanie. It's been brilliant chatting to you this afternoon. Time has flown by. We've eaten up 2 hours again without even trying. So part 3 coming again at some point, no doubt. It's been brilliant talking to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Part 3 will be the studies that where we have the full circle of results. But anyway, I will see you everywhere I go. That seems to be the way it is.
Indeed, yeah. We'll share a taxi somewhere. Thanks a million. Appreciate it, Stephanie.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you like this show and can think of other people that might like it too, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. If you can check 5 stars, I'd really appreciate that. Apparently, it really helps with the reach on some of these platforms that you're listening to it on. And of course, like and subscribe if that's possible too. Do check out our YouTube channel. There's plenty going on over there as well. These episodes are not possible without our sponsors, so thanks a million to Particles Plus, Eurovent, ACO and Farmwood. Without them, this just simply is not possible. So see you again next week.